Hello and welcome back to the Americano Show. Today we are going to be talking about Trump's drug war because the latest edition of the Spectator in America is Trump's drug war. MAGA has found the military conflict it wants, says Ben Domenech. And I was very amused, I think Ben was amused too, to see the reaction to this on Twitter when we posted on Twitter. It went semi-viral, I think we could say. A lot of people, a lot of MAGA supporters, Trump supporters, thought that we had sort of self-owned in some spectacular way. They seemed to think that The Spectator was some very anti-Trump magazine that had accidentally done a beautiful bit of Trump propaganda. When the truth is, actually, we don't do Trump propaganda and we don't do anti-Trump propaganda. We just try and make interesting editions of our great magazine. Ben, first of all, did you see some of this reaction? I think you did. We discussed it a little bit. And I should have mentioned that the Department of Homeland Security, hopefully we can flash up an image of what they produced. They did their own riff on it. I hope you found it as entertaining and mystifying as I did.
I was entertained by it. I have to say, first off, Freddie, that, look, this is all credit to the excellent artists that we have at Spectator, and they do excellent work. This is not the first time that they have produced either a cover or a splash for a piece that I've written where I've said, I really need to get a copy of that because it certainly is. It grabs the attention, especially compared to the kind of dreck that's produced in so many different publications that we will remain unnamed across America that take far less interest in that quality. So kudos to them. I was interested in the reaction to it because, yes, as you said, I think there were a lot of people unfamiliar with what we do here, perhaps in America, who are natural knee-jerk MAGA supporters who would assume that any kind of depiction of him that comes along by a publication is one that they presume to be negative, when in reality, I think the piece is intended to be quite balanced in terms of what it looks at, and we can get into that, about this new cartel conflict, the risks involved, and some of the backlash that they've experienced already. But I think that, one of the things that they are very aware of is that there's a long history in American publications of putting Trump on your cover, creating art around him that his supporters immediately embrace as making him look cool. And they'll put it on T-shirts and they'll, make copies of it. They'll put it on hats. They'll sell it at the various rallies. You see this sort of stuff crop up all the time, where things that are intended to make fun of the president are embraced by his supporters, and it's a way for them to take ownership of it. They certainly did that here. But I believe that the greatest irony in terms of this depiction is that what the piece makes clear, despite the fact that it was the Department of Homeland Security that immediately embraced this, emblazoned ICE logos on everything involved, and used it actually as promotional material for joining ICE. They replaced our logo with that. And I hat tip to the person in their comms department who had that idea. But the truth is that the piece basically says this is about taking this away from ICE, taking it away from the Department of Homeland Security, and instead investing this whole project in the Department of Defense under Pete Hegseth, something which has only been reiterated in the time since the piece was filed. Marco Rubio coming out in the wake of that boat targeting of a Venezuelan boat, the claim that they killed 11 members of the Tren de Aragua cartel transporting drugs in international waters. When Marco Rubio was asked about that by the press, he immediately made clear this is the Department of Defense operation. This is something that belongs under them, and that's the real shift. That's what we're seeing happening, and we're in the early stages yet. But I can't think of better timing for this piece, and I appreciate you, Freddie, for recognizing that, and I hope that people will give it a read.
Well, it is a fascinating piece, and I'm very struck by the fact that this administration is now using the term narco-terrorists, which somehow kind of combines Reagan's foreign policy with a Bush foreign policy with a Trump foreign policy. And I suppose that's the one of the reasons why your piece is so interesting is that, and why we put as the stand first, MAGA has finally found the conflict it wants, is that this kind of brings together different wings of the Republican Party as it currently is. It satisfies the hawkish urge to flex muscle abroad and to show American leadership outside of America, but it's also directly a national interest because it's protecting Americans' borders, it's protecting Americans from the war on drugs and so on.
Yes, I think this is a perfect example of them kind of discovering a Venn diagram where these different factions overlap. You had in the original Trump term this idea bandied about by Mike Pompeo and other sort of neocon leaning figures on Capitol Hill. Dan Crenshaw has some stuff on this, et cetera, that the cartels, there needed to be a stepped up operational approach to dealing with them. And that was something that was talked about, but it was never really taken as a step in the first Trump term. Like so many other things, it was put on the back burner because of all the distractions he was dealing with in that term. This time around, they started really from day one under the perception that this was going to be something that they did right off the bat, even including quotes that I, include in my piece and that, have been referenced elsewhere about this being something that was discussed during the transition. And that on the very first call that he had with Mexican officials, Pete Hegseth delivered the message that this was something that if the Mexicans and their government and their military did not step up their activity against the cartel, that America was willing to take offensive military action against the cartels themselves. In other words, a massive invasion of sovereignty from the perspective of the Mexicans, and they reacted, as you might expect, very upset about it. What I think you're seeing here is this overlay of the MAGA base, which is very anti-cartel, prioritizes the fentanyl issue, the human trafficking issue, and of course the migrant crime issue, which continues to be something that I think Democrats have not really been able to wrestle with in terms of their reaction to it politically. That's all something that the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world and a lot of other people who may sound dovish on foreign policy, there's an exception to that, and that's when it comes to these cartels. Of course, I already mentioned the neocons, the hawkish faction that would like to see American power projected. It particularly, they'd like to see something like regime change in Venezuela, and they've intimated that, not quietly over the last several years. And then there's this old school republicanism, which you made reference to. I didn't really get into that as much in my piece, but there is an evocation there of the Panama invasion, of Noriega, of everything that sort of goes back to that H.W. Bush. This is back when America, when we projected power, we did it with a light footprint. We got in there quick. We did what we had to do and we got out. None of this nation building stuff, which I think speaks to on the gut level, your base Republican traditionalist who was maybe not originally a MAGA person, but has come along entirely to it by now. And so this is a way for him to satisfy all of those different spectrums. And I think that, the social conservatives aren't going to be mad about it because they care about the human trafficking approach. They care about the fentanyl problem on the streets. The hawks are happy about it because they like to see American power used very effectively when it comes to killing bad guys, and we can get into the J.D. Vance Rand Paul interaction about that. And then I think the MAGA base is more than happy to say, hey, Obama was droning these people on the other side of the world, for years. Why can't we drone some of these people that are closer to America and they're doing actual damage to Americans here at home with what they're doing when we see them running in these gunboats, Miami Vice style, across international waters? And so, look, I think this is why it's turned out to be a conflict that is really becoming a war on narco-terror, and that is going to, I believe, lead to more activity in very short order in the coming months.
Well, let's touch on that J.D. Vance reaction. Explain to our viewers exactly what J.D. Vance said and why it was so shocking that he took on Rand Paul on X. And I think he used a swear word. What exactly happened there? That was quite...
I don't have the tweets in front of me, so I won't be able to say them verbatim. But essentially, J.D. Vance was out there defending the idea against some of the president's supporters and some people who are in the kind of Rand Paul category where they might be with the president 75% of the time, but that 25% is something where, they really have issues, and obviously Paul is someone who, as a libertarian minded individual, has discomfort with things like the Intel deal, with the tariff regime, with a lot of other things that the president has done on the economy that a lot of libertarians and free market minded people, have as issues. This, though, is the first real clash on foreign policy that I think he's gotten really amped up about, particularly when it comes to, Paul's insistence that, something like this requires an authorization of military force from the Congress, that, if this is really going to be a war, you've got to go through the process. He's a constitutionalist with this stuff. J.D. Vance, while in the past he might have shared some of those concerns, he's obviously part of the administration now. And he was essentially banging the drum against the people who were saying these types of things, saying that the president absolutely has the right to act in America's interest. And that, and this is, I think, the critical part. He said that this is the highest calling of the American military, to defend, American people and America's interest. And that's something that he's, emphatically in favor of. Obviously, he is, a veteran of combat zones himself in terms of his history. The issue there, of course, is a fundamental tension between kind of this portion of the Tea Party electorate from back, 15 years ago, that Paul obviously was a champion of, that kind of lost the argument. They were looking for a more libertarian foreign policy when it came to the use of military force and the projection of American power. And they didn't get it. They lost that argument. And it was clear they lost that argument despite President Trump's and then candidate Trump's leans in some libertarian directions on certain points. I think what Donald Trump figured out is that he could do things like, pardon the creator of Silk Road. He could do things like be a pro-Bitcoin president. He could do things like, pass, various criminal justice reforms, et cetera, and satisfy a lot of the different folks who are in that libertarian wing. I mean, obviously the top of the cherry on top would be, if he makes the intimated moves on marijuana that he's been indicating. But the point is, I think he basically discovered that he could do those moves while also droning terrorist leaders, and libertarians would be happy with him, or enough of the libertarians who actually vote would be happy with him for him to get that portion. And I don't think that was a misjudgment. I think he's right. And I think that frustrates a lot of people like Rand Paul, who wanted him to be more of a dovish. I don't really like the word dovish, because I think, they would describe themselves as realist or restrained minded or, something like that. And dovish is kind of an insult to them, I think, in some respects, because a lot of them are still in favor of having a significant military, just in terms of size or making it more efficient. But one of the things that I think really critically happened here is Donald Trump realized, I can get enough of the portion of the people who will vote for Rand Paul to also vote for me by doing all this other stuff that I'm comfortable with, and I still get to kill Soleimani from the skies and show American toughness when it comes to the Iran nuclear regime, and I'm not going to lose any of those votes.
Yes, so he's dividing and conquering the libertarian mind, and
yes.
It's worth remembering that libertarianism, while a very powerful intellectual force in America, has never really done anything at the ballot, whereas Trump quite obviously has.
But I would say one example, though, of libertarian votes are interesting in America in part because they're quite small, and I say this as someone who's ideologically quite libertarian myself. They're quite small, but they're in pockets in certain states where they matter more. I would say, for instance, in a state like Nevada that has sort of a bit more of a libertarian population in terms of their mindset, it's critical, I think, to be able to get that small portion, whatever it is. They're never going to be sizable enough, to elect someone statewide to do the kind of things. Rand Paul has to run as a Republican in order to win in Kentucky. But I think that the president recognized, and this is what he does. Bill Maher has actually made a really good argument about this in recent months, that what the president does is he identifies these different areas where he can bring people over to his side, and he doesn't have to embrace their whole agenda. He doesn't have to embrace we should have machines that can sell cocaine to minors, or pick your average sort of libertarian trope. I still remember the candidate who got booed for saying that we needed driver's licenses, and which I mean, come on. But it's one of these things where the president recognizes I can do a certain number of things, and he spoke at the Libertarian Convention this most recent time that he was running, and bring enough people over to my side. But I don't have to embrace your views holistically. And again, I think that gets back to that Venn diagram where you've got the overlap of everyone here, and you're not going to lose Marjorie Taylor Greene over something like this. And I think that that's wise on the president's part. But again, it's not without risk going down this road, especially with a nation in which we have so much of a significant level of American investment, and that we, is right across our southern border, that has the capability to do a lot of very bad things to us in very short order if we allow it.
Yes. What you're saying is he could nuke Mexico if he abolished driving licenses. that would be an effective bit of triangulation.
That's a hypothesis, Freddie.
Yeah. Well, I did wonder, another interesting aspect of your piece is this pressure that the Trump administration is trying to put on the Mexican government, and it occurred to me that it's this thing you often get with Trump, and particularly with its sort of major policies, is guesswork as to whether it's real or it's leverage, and the answer, it seems, is it's both. They both mean that they are going to be militarily aggressive in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere, particularly in the seas. But they also are using the threat, the very real threat, to get the Mexican government to do what they want. And that is what?
Yes. And so one thing that people should understand is that, if you don't pay a lot of attention to Mexican politics, this is a period of transition for Mexico. You're probably familiar with Claudia Sheinbaum, the Berkeley-educated, very bright woman who has taken over in the wake of the departure of the previous president, AMLO, who is in sort of semi-retirement on his ranch, theoretically writing a book about Mexican history, but in reality running the show. I mean, it's a Godfather situation. He's really in charge, and all of his former capos, all of his former people are still around, and including family members. And they don't really respect Claudia Sheinbaum for some interesting reasons. Mostly it's kind of the idea, I compare it to the difference between someone like Bernie Sanders, who perhaps has a little bit more of a pragmatic capability of understanding what is achievable realistically, with a kind of stars in their eyes, true believer, Sanders bro, or in this case, Sanders fangirl, who thinks that the utopian ideas that he espoused are something that can realistically be achieved. And Sheinbaum, I think, is more in that category, or at least viewed as such. The problem is that she doesn't have as much of a strong political base within the Morena party organization as AMLO does. She's dependent on him, and that's one of the reasons people believe that she was elevated, was because she effectively would do this job without standing in the way of anything that he wanted to achieve. And in fact, some of his cronies have gotten in the way when it came to some of her prior nominations and the like. What I think is going on here is that Sheinbaum has tried to play the game with Trump the way that a lot of people do. We've seen other leaders do this, of course, Freddie. They come in, they have a conversation with Trump, they praise him, they promise cooperation, they say only good things in his presence, and then they turn around to their home country and in their own language say very different things. And in Sheinbaum's case, certainly she's been critical of America, not to the point of AMLO's criticism, where he was talking about all of Mexicans across America rising up in defense of the homeland should America attack the cartels during the closing days of his tenure. But one thing that I think is critical right now is Sheinbaum has to decide which side of this situation she wants to be on. And the leverage that they're using currently against the Venezuelan cartels and criminal organizations across both South America and the Caribbean are, from my perspective, an attempt to essentially encircle Mexico and force them to make more significant change. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that this White House Stephen Miller and others who are obviously, very focused on these issues. This White House truly believes that the Mexicans have basically turned off the spigot of human trafficking by the cartels that led to that, it's impossible to deny a historic level of illegal immigration under Joe Biden that came across the southern border, that they basically turned that off when Trump got back into office. That it's as much his presence and the policy changes, it have had an effect on the border. More of it has to do with the cartels making the decision. These are going to be some lean years, and then we'll go back to potentially having fat years again in the future. This White House is not satisfied with that. They want to see more permanent steps taken against these cartel organizations, more permanent crackdowns on their work. They want their power to diminish to a point where they don't have the ability to just turn the spigot back on. And that would require the Mexican government and their army, which is full of a lot of different corrupt actors, to take on a different posture toward these cartels and to enforce things based on both their own awareness and, of course, American intelligence that they may not want to do in order to rock the boat and potentially create backlash in some of these communities. So we'll see whether that happens. But if it does not, I think that the message that has clearly been sent to Mexico is, we have a network of drones, spy planes, capabilities that do not require us to put boots on the ground permanently in Mexico or do things that, put American lives at risk, where we can dramatically impact the level of resources and the capabilities of these cartels. And we are not going to respect your sovereignty so much that we are unwilling to do so. Instead, and I truly believe this, that multiple people have said this, that, cooperation is all in the press release that you put out. So if you say, we thank the Mexican government for their cooperation in this raid on some cartel, that doesn't actually have to be true in terms of what the Trump administration is willing to do. And you would expect, I think, the Mexicans to have to go along with it if they do pull the trigger in that regard.
Well, another phrase that you hear Trump administration people talking about now is talking about the Western Hemisphere and talking about power like a revisionist power. It's another subject that people have probably talked a bit too much about in the last year, is that America, Russia and China are becoming more like traditional 19th century revisionist powers, which means they're becoming more assertive in their near abroad interests. And obviously the Western Hemisphere, the Gulf of America, as it is now called, is a very primary American near interest.
Yes, and I think that this Western Hemisphere talk is one of these examples where you have something that went from the type of intellectual, populist, nationalist, conservative set that did find its way into this Trump administration in a way that it didn't in the prior one. It creates a more coherent concept of what the administration is trying to achieve in asserting more power in its neighborhood and over its neighbors. And, obviously the president engages in flights of fancy when it comes to Canada and talking about it as a 51st state. But I do believe he was serious about the Greenland aspect of this. And I think he's serious when it comes to exercising and expressing power over Panama and over other, nations to our south. And that, I think, is something that is of significance, because it obviously is a callback to a lot of presidents that he respects, many of whom are on the wall of the Oval Office right now, including obviously Andrew Jackson. And that's the way that I think he thinks of himself, is reestablishing American power in the Western Hemisphere so that we are respected by our neighbors and not getting so far afield and these battles and conflicts that happen on the other side of the world, which I think that he has always had an animosity toward, a reluctance to engage in that extends back before he was even in politics. And that's something that, for the generation of Americans like J.D. Vance, who lived through the war on terror in a personal manner, and that includes, of course, many of the other members of his administration. I pointed that out in the past in Spectator, as have others, that, the generational shift of going from a group of people who were colonels and generals during the war on terror, during the height of that 25 years ago, to people who were actually on the ground or who were signing up to go and serve, as so many of these people in this administration in key roles did, gives you a different perspective on things. And I think a lot of them want to be more focused on things that are closer to home. And of course, what that does, in addition to sort of being something that speaks to the MAGA-based priorities, is it runs the risk of having arguments no longer being made about the international efforts of opponent nations, of adversarial nations, potentially, that we've seen take place in the conversation around defense and foreign policy over the past several years. You are, I'm sure, aware of the defense policy paper that was put together for Secretary Hegseth by Bridge Colby and other figures in the administration as well, of course, but Colby is the lead on it, of the national defense strategy going forward. And people are already being critical about it when it comes to China, that they view this report as essentially conceding things about Chinese power that could lead to us backing off from support of Taiwan in the future, could lead to us, basically taking a back seat in terms of our international presence. And for people who care about free trade, for people who care about, American involvement in global markets, that's of significant concern. Or, if you're someone like me who cares a lot about the presence of communist China and their attempts to control a lot of different aspects around the world, that's also of concern. But the alternative vision that it basically lays out is a Western Hemisphere vision, one where America's priorities and its funding are directed more to solving things that are closer to home and within the Western Hemisphere, as opposed to engaging in any kind of brinksmanship, any kind of potential to lead to a great power conflict.
Well, and it is precisely that, isn't it? In the near abroad, it's ridding, not just asserting American power, but ridding Chinese influence. I mean, if you talk to anybody who knows about these things, they don't have to be conspiracy theory minded to think that China or Russia, indeed, is involved in immigration problems around the world, and is also involved in drug distribution around the world. How deliberately the CCP is doing it is a very difficult question to answer. But it's certainly, in Latin America, the administration is quite clear that China's tentacles are there and they want to remove them.
Yes. And they have an enormous presence and investment presence all across, in major areas in South America, including, building their own port systems and a number of other steps that they've taken that have raised the hackles of America. We truly don't we don't know, at least publicly, though I believe our intel services know more about this, the degree to which they've invested in ways that could be exploited potentially in any kind of conflict moving forward. And then as it relates to the drug aspect of what you're talking about, whether the CCP is pushing this itself or whether they're simply allowing it to happen, at the end of the day, there's not that much of a difference, because they have the power to stop it if they wanted to, and they certainly are not. And that, of course, includes shipping a lot of the elements that are used in order to make these very profitable drugs into other countries, particularly Mexico, and then allowing the cartels to use it for their own financial benefit, and of course to the disruption of Americans and to the deaths of many Americans. And so, I think that what you're seeing here is some of the people who have been China hawks, but are uncomfortable with making the case that, say, we should be throwing more money at the Taiwan issue, or we should be producing more weapon systems. We should be stepping up our presence in the Pacific in an anticipation of potential conflicts going forward with China. Some of the people who are uncomfortable with that, this is also, again, back to that Venn diagram, it's a way for them to make the case that, hey, I want to be tough on China too. I just want to be tough on them where it's closer to home and where they're actually, doing something that's killing American citizens currently, as we see with fentanyl and the like.
And then is the fear then for people of a more hawkish disposition on China that, because America has asserted itself in the Western Hemisphere and perhaps North in Canada too, that maybe Taiwan is in China's near interest, and maybe it's not America's fight.
Yeah, I think that I have had many conversations about this actually in the last couple of months. And one of the things that I hear consistently from the analysts who I speak to who pay attention to China around the clock is that they anticipate a situation where in the either in the closing year or the year after Trump's term is kind of the point where they think a move could be made, a significant move by China as regards Taiwan, and that they're very concerned that this is a ticking clock situation, that they don't want to get into it in the midst of Trump's term, but that they would like to get perhaps into an election year where it's more difficult to deal with it, or you could see it playing out in different ways. They might want to have a situation where they could potentially be dealing with the president Gavin Newsom or somebody like that. They might find that to be a more predictable situation than dealing with Donald Trump. That Trump's lack of predictability has always been something that he uses to great effect. And so there's open discussion about the timing that the Chinese have, but no one is of the mindset that China is taking their eye off of Taiwan in any respect. And they are concerned that this shift toward a Western Hemisphere view could potentially create openings for America's adversaries around the world that we come to regret, especially if they end up, taking significant control of the global supply chain in ways that could negatively affect American markets, American consumers, and et cetera, who have to this point, I believe, not really ever heard a case for why Americans should care about Taiwan or why Americans should care about this aspect of international policy. Certainly, they haven't heard it from Donald Trump yet. And I think that the handful of senators and congressmen who do talk about it consistently, they don't really get as much attention. So, yes, there's concerns about China. But, again, this is a president who was supposed to get rid of TikTok and still keeps finding ways to delay it. Perhaps David Ellison can buy that next.
Well, we're getting dangerously, but I think rightly, but dangerously away from the initial subject, which is Trump's drug war.
Yes.
I just thought, in conclusion, Ben, if you could tell us, you said that there may be more actions, that American military involvement might get deeper, greater. What would that look like?
Well, I think it would look like a very significant and probably not telegraphed in any way level of activity against the cartels that includes multiple drone attacks, potentially some exfiltrating. If you do have special forces go in, it would be to take some people out of Mexico who are currently hiding in places who they don't want to transfer over. One thing I should have mentioned earlier is that in the early stages, post that Pete Hegseth call, I should say, back in the early days of the administration, which cast a whole pall over the relationship between Mexico and the Trump administration, Claudia Sheinbaum, in part because of that, and in part because of the tariff threats, made the decision to have an unprecedented release of an enormous number of people who the United States government has wanted to put on trial here in America for their various drug-related crimes for a very long time. It was a handover of prisoners unlike anything that we've seen before historically. And it was meant to buy time and also satisfy, from their perspective, the demands of this new regime. Unfortunately, I think that they misjudged things slightly, because the truth is, when DOJ got a lot of these people in, their eyes got big because of all the intel that they could get from these various people, many of whom are not long separated from having key roles within the cartels, that they could pull out and learn about the different figures, the different levels of corruption, where certain people and assets were that we may not know because we don't have the same level of on-the-ground human intelligence in Mexico that you might like. A lot of it is Overwatch stuff, which is, dependent on the drones and our technology. And the general takeaway is that they haven't flipped everyone publicly, at least. You do want to keep them alive in prison after all, or in witness protection in the case of some of them. But there has been public awareness of multiple deals that have been made with some of these key figures. And sometimes that includes protection of family who is back in Mexico. It includes, deals that have details that we may not know about. But the general impression, at least in those who cover Mexico for a living, is that a number of these people are giving over information about where certain assets are and where individuals are that America didn't previously have. And so I think you could see America act on that in a very significant way. One of the lines that an analyst told me during reporting this piece was that there was no part of Mexico that we can't reach. And part of that has to do with the fact that the military there is not really focused on defending Mexico from external forces. It's about internal control. It's about making sure that these cities and towns run the way that the government in Mexico City wants to see them run. And of course, in many instances, that includes protecting the cartels and protecting their assets. So because of that, they're less, they have less of the technology or the capability to protect against those types of attacks from the sky and an American activity. And the Americans know that. The Department of Defense has war gamed this out. NORTHCOM would be the Northern Command would be the one in charge of this, and it's something that I think that they are kind of very well prepared for should the president decide to pull the trigger. And I think that with every passing week, it seems more and more likely that that's going to be the case. They want this to be something that is a narrative storyline, and if the criticism that they're getting is from Democrats and from Rand Paul, the White House is perfectly happy to accept that as the price of what they do when it comes to the cartels.
Well, Ben, it's absolutely fascinating stuff and a fascinating piece. Thank you very much for it. And I'll just wave this cover around. Trump's drug war. It's beautiful.
I will say I do want to try to get him to sign this one.
I think we're gonna
have to send me a couple extra copies.
We're gonna give that a real push. I think that's good. We want it framed in the close to the Oval Office, if not actually.
I think he might do that one.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Ben. And you're quite right to point out the artist Pep Bauerteller. He's called. He's done an absolutely brilliant job, as he always does. Thanks, Ben. All the best.
Great to be with you.